Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. You know, as I say every week, but it's true every week, it's been a great day for British democracy. We hear that there are protesters at Edinburgh Castle who are outraged and are quoting breaches of Magna Carta as the source of their outrage. Which is somewhat peculiar because, as the Court of Session has said, Magna Carta has no force of law in Scotland. It is an English document, and at the time of its execution in 1215, England was an independent country from Scotland. Strange people, strange protesters. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are talking to South Africa-based author Dr. David Patrick, to get his take on the coverage of genocide in different parts of the world. And that may be, who knows, pertinent, particularly if we are to believe the rhetoric about the Afghanistan and the Taliban. And also on what's happening in Scotland. And we'll be talking about his forthcoming book, which deals with the coverage of a referendum in 2014. And he'll be taking your questions live. Details on how to submit your questions, as always, are on the What's On guide. TNT, The Nation Talks, is very much in your hands. We like your questions. We'll try and cover as many as we can. And remember, we're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. We're here for you. Now, to our guest tonight. The Nation talks to Dr. David Patrick. How are you, David? I know the pandemic is almost coming to an end, but how did it affect you?
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on. Well, when I was in South Africa, when the pandemic hit, at first there was the usual sort of fears as it spread, as it came to, and as like sort of pockets of it started being detected, then that's when the lockdown measures came in, and the original lockdown in South Africa was pretty strict. Like not only in terms of like restriction of movement and social distancing and all those kind of things, they also instantly banned, for example, like alcohol and cigarettes. And that was like from the very word go. And one of the interesting little side notes that happened over there was I got to actually witness how like a black market develops in real time, because obviously cigarettes were banned, but that didn't mean that people like myself stopped smoking. But it just means that there's other ways to find it, and that was a kind of interesting aspect of it. But overall, it's for all its faults, South Africa is quite a resilient country, and a lot of aspects of society managed to adapt quite quickly once the serious lockdown measures were eased, because ultimately, because the economy is so unstable there, and because a lot of people are working day-to-day jobs, obviously there was no furlough scheme in South Africa, so they can't afford to be taking days or weeks off their work, and the economy can't really afford to be grinding to a halt like that, much less than a westernized country could. So the stranger sort of experience really was things like that I hadn't really I'd taken for granted before, like going to the cinema or going to a football game, is just being in like a large crowd of people, and those like sort of incidental conversations and interactions you have, you end up missing them after a while. But no, we got through it, and certainly I know that my experience of lockdown was much more tolerable than a lot of people had to go through. So in that respect, I was very fortunate. But nonetheless, I'm very, very glad to be back in Scotland finally for the first time in more than 2 years.
Talking about Scotland and also South Africa, what are the major differences, would you say, between the two places?
It'd be like, how long have you got? I don't think the remaining 55 minutes would be enough, John. Well, obviously, one of the major things is the demographic and racial composition of the country, and the impact that has on daily interactions, the way that politics is run, the way that everyday business, the way that it's got an influence on everything. And also it's incredibly diverse in multiple ways, in a way that Scotland doesn't. Like, it's got multiple various landscapes and sort of environments and habitats, depending on which part of the country you're in. But then on like a more social level, and I'm trying to think of like, because I don't want to just sit here, because it is South Africa, and there's a lot of things that I could differentiate or contrast with Scotland, but I would just be listing a list of like horrific things in most instances. So to try and avoid going down that route, one interesting aspect is how much, especially to Afrikaners, like how much rugby means to them. Because I know obviously football's a huge thing. It's very like tribalistic over here, and it's probably a lot more important to some people than at times it merits. But in terms of like a source and a part of people's intrinsic identity, what rugby means, especially to Afrikaners, is a very, very interesting dynamic to see. And the fact that at the end, it was in November 2019, I was there when South Africa won the World Cup, historically for the first time with a black captain, was an amazing thing to be part of. Because if we're being 100% honest, even the most optimistic side of me would not expect Scotland to win the World Cup anytime soon. So being able to sort of enjoy that sort of by proxy was really, really good. And it's a very, very interesting, and it's temporary, but it's a fascinating and very hopeful dynamic, is the fact that for that one day, a lot of the kind of problems and tensions in South Africa temporarily dissipate, and it's everyone's South African for that day. But so it was an incredibly big part of that, and that's one distinct contrast. But the other aspect, but I won't go on complaining about this for too long. But from living in South Africa, and again, I've been there for so long now that you get used to these kind of things. It's only from coming back to Lanarkshire and back to Scotland that you realise how easy it is to get used to things like the lights in your house not working, or the Wi-Fi not working, or the water not working, and all those little things are a sort of constant irritation. Maybe not all at the same time, but they're incredibly common in South Africa, along with things like road maintenance and blah blah blah. And those kind of things, it's incredible how used to them you can get. And then when you come back here, obviously everywhere's got those small irritations and inconveniences, but in South Africa they do take those things to like a level which I'm not entirely sure would be tolerated by people back here.
Stephen Kelly is asking, is there any he's asking, how is Scottish independence seen in South Africa? Is it seen at all?
Because one of the things is, because like, especially for the majority of the population in South Africa, their focus is on their day-to-day living because of their economic circumstances, and that's completely understandable. So realistically, for the vast majority of people in that country, they have no dog in that fight. They have no interest in it, or even they probably are not even aware of it, to be honest. And the best I'll get when I've been over there and had like multiple conversations with people on it is, again, an interesting thing, but this probably won't come as a surprise to people, given like the history between the Dutch or the Afrikaans South Africans and Britain. There's a lot of if you speak to Afrikaners about Scottish independence, a lot of them are all for it because they see it as like a sort of anti-British thing. So that's one aspect. But in terms of people having, entrenched or informed or enlightened views on it over there, not really, is because generally most people have got bigger things to worry about in a day-to-day context in South Africa than what's happening, 6,000 miles away.
And it's probably also got something to do with the coverage. I mean, I don't know what I mean, I assume there's the broadcast media and there's the print media, but I suspect that not much of that is given over to talking about many places outside South Africa. If our press is any guide, that's for sure.
Oh no, that same sort of regional and international proximity bias that exists in all national media systems, applies to South Africa as well. So where you get international news, it's more likely in the first instance to concern other southern African countries, so like Zimbabwe or Zambia or Botswana, something like that, or on a wider scale, the African continent. But then again, you will, on the SABC, the main news, you will still get quite frequent reports from the likes of Britain or America if there's a major story. Like Trump was all like in the local news, like Trump was very frequently mentioned. I noticed if I was driving through town, but like generally the story had absolutely nothing to do with South Africa, but because it's still the centre of the kind of English speaking media. And for various other kind of cultural reasons, that has a resonance down there. But no, the majority of the media is focused on South African issues because if most of the news is bad news, believe me, they have got more than enough to fill up their schedule in South Africa.
I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said all these hundreds of years ago, news is what someone somewhere doesn't want to see in print. Anything else is advertising. Oh, Melanie McCain is saying, she's saying, "Hi, Patrick. My family live in Joburg." Did you ever get to Joburg?
Yeah, I've been there. I've been there a few times. The thing that overwhelmed me, I was probably a bit naive. The thing that overwhelmed me about Johannesburg and Pretoria and Soweto, like this, the larger like Gauteng metropolis, was just how big and how built up and urbanized it was. Like even on a scale, like if obviously, to me, like growing up in rural Lanarkshire, like somewhere like Hamilton was big, right? But then by extension, somewhere like I consider Glasgow like a big, densely populated city that covers a large area. But it's even to give like people a sort of sense of scale of how this larger Gauteng metropolis area is. It's the economic heart of South Africa, and probably by definition the African continent. Hugely populated, massive businesses, a lot of industries and stuff there, and a massive population. But you can drive through that for 2 hours, 3 hours, and you never ever leave a built up environment, like to a point which would make sort of London seem small by comparison. So in the times I went to Johannesburg, that was the first thing that jumped, especially as like I said, like a country boy. It was like the sort of scale of it and how big it was, because even though I live in Bloemfontein and it's one of the 3 capital cities in South Africa, it's not a particularly huge city. I think it's only got a population total maybe about 300,000. So even by like sort of like British standards, and that it's not a notably large city. So yeah, when I've made the sort of 4.5 hour drive to Johannesburg, I was kind of like overwhelmed by it the few times, because it's like something out of like a kind of comic book or a dystopian novel. It's just enormous.
Yeah, all big cities can be like that. I mean, I remember going to Tokyo and thinking, how do you cope? Because I went down to the underground and I thought, I can't read kanji. I mean, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to? and everything there was English everywhere. And maybe a hangover from the Second World War, I don't know, an occupation, but it was straightforward. And a nice little lady, way back then, this was many years ago, in the trains would actually tell you in English the name of the next station, which I thought was great. Otherwise, I would have gotten lost forever down there. As it is,
it's certainly something that helped me integrate and adapt to living there very quickly, or quicker than I think I would have, is that even though there's, I might be corrected on this, but I think there's 13 recognised official languages in South Africa, but there are some which are used more as a sort of lingua franca more than others, and English is one of them, and it's because it's incredible. Like most people out there can speak multiple languages, and in some instances people can speak 4 or 5 languages fluently. So generally, even if English isn't their first language, you can get enough to have to communicate, or in most instances have like a basic conversation. But I think a dynamic that happens to me all the time because I'm out is anytime someone addresses me in a shop, or 90% of the time when someone addresses me in a shop, they speak to me in Afrikaans. Because I'm white and I'm in Bloemfontein, they assume that I'm an Afrikaans speaker. And I always have to kind of say like, oh, I'm really sorry, mate, but blah, blah, blah. And and then again, they're like, oh, where's your accent from? And you get into the same conversations about Scotland. And but it's a nice thing. In general, they're actually very, very like friendly people, South Africans, and they're very like inquisitive about like other people's cultures, and they're very, very welcoming. And certainly in the time I've been there, I can't fault the society for that.
Good, that's good. Let's talk a little bit about your specialisation, if I can call it that, David, because your thesis, your doctorate thesis in 2013 was about the manner in which instances of genocide and mass violence have been covered by British and American newspapers. What were some of the, I mean, I gather you looked at the Holocaust, Bosnia and Rwanda. What were your conclusions?
I suppose the main conclusion, before I go into any depth on this, and the main takeaway from it, is a very, very cynical conclusion to come to, but the evidence to my mind points to nothing else, is that despite the supposed and well publicised British and American commitment to the protection of human rights, the instances of mass violence in the 1990s in Bosnia and Rwanda demonstrate that that's, in most instances, is nothing more than baseless platitudes with nothing based in reality. And for all intents and purposes, when these things happen, even if they're on a catastrophic scale, like happened in Rwanda, that at best the British media and the American media don't even get out of second gear, let alone make this a priority issue, which would line up with the rhetoric on the subject. So that would be the main conclusion that I would draw from it. But it would depend which aspects of it you would like me to delve into a bit more.
How did you separate that from the generally accepted view that media, by and large, in the West in particular, is just dumbing down? I mean, media is becoming much more tabloid. If it bleeds, it leads. But ideally, it should bleed locally.
Oh, yeah.
If I'm
again, that whole
cynical.
idea of if it bleeds, it leads is very specific to again, these regional dynamics. Like potential, like say someone being murdered in London could get more coverage in the UK news than 10,000 people dying in a country if it's on the other side of the globe. So that dynamic does come in, and it does challenge that whole thing. If it bleeds, it leads, because there was like a lot of blood flowed in both Bosnia and Rwanda, but in very few instances did they lead the news cycle in any meaningful way, apart from some very, very specific instances. And particularly an aspect when you actually so an overall dynamic is that the Western press don't really give genocide or mass violence the press coverage or the press attention or focus or the priority status which we would probably be led to assume that they should, based on cultural assumptions and political rhetoric to that effect. But even and even the more troubling aspect of it is when you compare the coverage to Bosnia and Rwanda, there is a specific and noticeable contrast which leans towards Bosnia. Bosnia got infinitely more coverage in terms of front page exposure, letters published on it, editorial columns, comment pieces, and almost every variable you can count. Bosnia, across a similar time period, got infinitely more coverage than Rwanda, even though, and it's a very clumsy and callous way to calculate this, but in terms of just the number of people who died in a very, very short period of time, is Rwanda was a worse event. It was a more catastrophic event, but because it happened in sub-Saharan Africa, in a country which very few people knew about, let alone cared about, it could never get to the top of the news agenda. And it's, again, going back to those sources, and when you see this, the way especially the coverage of the Rwandan genocide was framed, it very, very rarely got out of second gear. If it was ever of interest, it was almost always because it had some focus in the story which was based in Western interests. The fact that this many people were dying, literally in the hundreds of thousands, and the fact in the space of a few weeks, that was never ever the main focus of the story. And it was only in Rwanda actually only became a major news event, similar in the way that Afghanistan is leading all the headlines and all the news reports at the moment, for however brief a time, for a period of about 10 days to 2 weeks after the genocide had actually finished. But it became a refugee crisis which was affecting countries round about. Then Rwanda became the news story. But the most troubling aspect of it, from my perspective, from researching this for so long, is the actual fact that between 800,000 and perhaps 1 million people were brutally murdered in less than 3 months. That in itself was not a major story in the Western press, and I think that's probably the most worrying observation.
Did you come to a view? I mean, that's shocking. It really is shocking. Did you come to a view about the quality of the reporting? I mean, okay, it was sparse relative to the scale of the tragedy, but was there also a quality problem? And the reason I asked this question is because you mentioned Afghanistan, and we touched upon that at the beginning. One of the issues that keeps cropping up, and it happened in Bosnia too, I think, to maybe a lesser degree, was how uninformed the informed were. So when they spoke to their audiences, it lacked accuracy. Did you? And I'll come on to, if we get time, I'll come on to what I mean specifically by that. But let me just leave it with one fact. The British Embassy right now in Afghanistan has almost no one who speaks the local dialect. The Foreign Office in London, the office that's charged with responsibility for Afghanistan, I gather from Rory Stewart, who spent some time in Afghanistan, he said some years ago there was nobody in that office who'd actually been to Afghanistan. So people were making policy, and presumably journalists were informed by these people who were making policy. I just wondered if you had developed any thoughts on the quality of the reporting that did take place.
No, well, there's probably two main aspects to bring up there. For one, again, because it was geographically closer, it was people that look like us to a far greater degree. The coverage during the Bosnian War, especially, which covered Sarajevo, had a level of, how they're described as, compassion and empathy, which was completely lost in the coverage of Rwanda. And I think that's because Sarajevo, as opposed to Rwanda's capital, Kigali, for example, had a cultural place in the West because the Olympics had been held there. That's where Torval Dean won the gold medal. People from Britain and America had been on holiday to Sarajevo and had pictures of it and whatnot. So the coverage of that was, I would say, of a greater quality because journalists, often actually in quite dangerous conditions, could at least be embedded in there to a far greater degree. In Rwanda, and again, this only really becomes obvious when you can go through the discourse to a very kind of fine degree and repeated readings of it, is there was actually several aspects of the coverage that got Rwanda fundamentally wrong. One of which was, very early on, it was described as in anarchic terms, as if it was a free-for-all, as if it was out of control. It was presented as if it was just a country had gone collectively mad. But this wasn't. But by all accounts that have been published since, and all the evidence points to, it was one of the most well-organized genocides in history. In the first 6 weeks, to give you an example of how organized this was, it was between 3 and 5 times faster than the Holocaust. So when you look at and that can't be done by definition. That level of murder and killing on that scale in multiple locations cannot happen if it's not being organised to the nth degree. But the coverage from the newspapers presented the complete opposite. So that was one aspect. The second one.
Sorry, just to stop you there for a second, David. What inspired that lack of accuracy, do you think?
One, I think, yes, to touch on what you were talking about, one is there were very, very few regional experts on Rwanda, so who had actually had, connections with the country and whatnot, and had reliable sources. It was a very dangerous and very disconnected country for us because there's civil war going on as well. So unless you had United Nations protection, very, very few journalists were ever in the country. And another aspect of it that a lot of people, I think, forget historically is Rwanda suffered in terms of timing because, well, it'd be 6 weeks into the genocide No, not 6 weeks, 3 weeks into the genocide, the first democratic elections took place in South Africa. And the majority of the world's international media were focused on there because the international media have only got limited resources. And certainly, as you know, John, those resources are very, very rare, are only very rarely pointed towards Africa, unless it's, the usual stories: famine, disaster, war. And the move and the move from, or the transition from South Africa to like a free democracy at that time allowed them to present this, a good news story from South Africa. And you've got, the sort of like iconic Nelson Mandela leading it at the time. But the coverage of Rwanda suffered because of that. Because as an indication, by some estimates, there was probably at least 2,500 foreign press in South Africa in late April 1994 to cover those elections. By contrast, in Rwanda, throughout that entire genocide, the number of foreign journalists in that country never rose above 15. So when you consider how catastrophic, how nightmarishly terrible that event was, the fact that it gathered so little press for so many reasons is quite a condemnation of where Western interests and priorities truly lie.
I think you started off by looking at the Holocaust in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Do you think what was your view of the coverage of that, and how did that coverage affect or influence what happened thereafter?
Well, it's interesting because for a start, the first flurry of press attention to what at that time didn't have a collective term, like the Holocaust, it was the crimes of the Nazis, was in April and May 1945, when the Nazi Empire's crumbling. They'd been invaded from the east by the Russians. Obviously, Britain and America are invading from the west, and that's when they first discovered these places that have become very infamous in history, like Buchenwald, Belsen, Dachau. So the concentration camps inside the sort of central German Reich, and obviously the things that they found there were absolutely catastrophic, and some of them were almost beyond belief to the people who witnessed them. When they entered the gates of Belsen, there was 10,000 corpses in the grounds. So these soldiers, many of them are young men, 18 to 21 years old, who had already been through various trials and tribulations related to war and combat and all those kind of things. Even hardened soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing, and for a period of about 6 weeks between April and May 1945, there's a huge press interest in this, and that's to also contextualize it at the time. As you have to remember, is in the Second World War, because of rationing and stuff like that. The idea of like a story being covered on 3 or 4 consecutive papers of a newspaper because pages were at a premium says something in itself. So you had this initial outburst, and that was the first and the most important aspect of that, I think, culturally, is those discoveries allowed, after the war in Europe, it allowed the Allies to be able to present the war not just as a war between nation states based on ideological and economic means. They could present it in the decades since, which they still do, partially based on this, as a war between good and evil. And then the discoveries in April and May in 45 managed to do that. But one thing that a lot of people, I suppose, don't realise or appreciate is it isn't a steady progression upwards from there in terms of Western and European appreciation for or memorialisation of the Holocaust. There's the period directly after that. It doesn't really get spoken about, and obviously people who are directly affected by it don't really want to talk about it, and etc. So over the decades that followed, it was mass media or various media engagements with the Holocaust that slowly brought it into the public consciousness. And the main ones, I would argue, in this respect, without going on about anything for far too long, would be the publication of the Diary of Anne Frank, because that is quite a gentle entrance into, or introduction into the ideas of like oppression and whatnot. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s, the release of Holocaust. There was a TV series in the US in the mid 1970s, gathered about 120 million viewers or something like that at the time. And it was a bit of a kind of cultural phenomenon. But then the peak of this, and this is where it lines up with the case studies I was talking about, is arguably, even to this day, the peak of this, of what you might call Holocaust awareness in the West, was specifically, I think, in 1993, which was the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Mall in Washington, where a lot of very, very famous, US monuments and whatnot are. But even more so than that, that was also the release to great critical acclaim and cultural relevance, was the release of Schindler's List. So just to tie all this together, so I hope this makes sense to people, is the year like 1993, or the early 1990s at the very least, can be seen as a high point for Holocaust awareness. And for at least 20 years before this, the Holocaust has always been taught as supposedly a method of teaching people about how the dangers of genocide and mass violence, and how you can't stand aside when things like that are happening. But at this same cultural high point, where the Holocaust was probably better known than it ever was or has been, both Rwanda and Bosnia demonstrated that the lessons that were supposedly being taught by the Holocaust weren't really worth anything, because for various political reasons and whatnot, even mass violence or genocide of the scale of Rwanda won't really generate any sort of response.
I mean, it's just, it's fascinating, isn't it? How I mean, because we can't help but compare and contrast what's happening, for example, this afternoon in the House of Commons, where they were debating Afghanistan, and where there was an enormous amount of rhetoric about how the government had mismanaged this, and how the Home Secretary should have got up off his sunbed and paid the Foreign Secretary and paid some attention to what was happening. He might even, from his sunbed, have phoned the foreign secretaries of the neighbouring countries in Pakistan and in Russia and Iran and India. Apparently, he didn't do any of those things. He stayed glued to his sunbed and had to be crowbarred off it in order to get to the House of Commons. The rhetoric was about criticism of him and his boss. But a lot of it, I think, to some people, particularly considering what you've just said, sounds rather empty. We lost all these troops, we spent all this money. The Taliban are dreadful people, and women in particular are going to be severely prejudiced in this new regime. But I didn't hear anything that said, this is what we're going to do, apart from we'll take some refugees once in a while.
And even the commitment, well, the support, commitment is probably far too strong a word. Even these supposed promises that they'll take, X number, I think it's 20,000 refugees. It's over something like a 5-year period, which is, I mean, ultimately, if they actually took that number, it would make a difference to those individuals, so it couldn't be discredited. But really, when you think of the scale of the problem in that country, as you rightly pointed out, John, is the response from a lot of politicians, both in Britain and America, has very much been one of sort of wringing their hands of it. And as much as I can see that, like, a lot of the press are sort of united in the condemnation of this, give it a few weeks, and I don't even think Afghanistan will be being mentioned anywhere near the front pages. We'll have moved on to something else.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Prince Andrew is thanking his lucky stars that the Taliban have emerged, talking about things disappearing from the front pages. I was struck, though, by the Home Secretary's response when she was asked 20,000 over X years, but only 5,000 maybe in the short term. And she said, that's as much as we can cope with, which sounds on face value, a sort of an answer of sorts. But the reality is, her boss, scarcely 3 weeks ago, had offered to accommodate the entire population of Hong Kong, which at the last count was around about 3 million, going on 4, depending on who's doing the counting. It just sounds, it goes back to your earlier point about, some people, there's some groups where the media pay attention to them, where the politicians are sympathetic, other groups perhaps not quite so much. And for some reason, residents of Hong Kong fall into the first group and Afghan fall into the latter group, it sounds like.
Unfortunately so, but that's been a dynamic that has been a part of the press since news has been in print. There's always the group that supposedly, well, the news is relevant and it matters then, but then when you do actually see when you see the contrast in what is apparently in media currency, if you want to call it that, like how much certain lives are devalued depending on which region of the world they stay in, and the fact that it can be ignored to that degree. I mean, an example that always sticks in my head from that book, and it was several thousand articles I had to read to try and inform this properly. One that always sticks in my head was, and I think it was from the Guardian, if I'm being correct, was when the first occasion that the official figure or the official estimate, if we're being honest, from the UN of a death toll of 500,000, 500,000 people, was reported in the Western press. It was in the Guardian, and it was on a tiny little box mention of an article of about 80, 90 words on page 24. And that, so the fact that you know that in a space of 5-6 weeks that many people have died, but it's still secondary to numerous other stories, which surely must pale in comparison. And that's why, as I think, as we progress through the 21st century, I can't really comment on scale, but there's a likelihood based on several indicators that the frequency of genocidal or mass violence events will become more frequent in more localized areas or regions because of things like water scarcity, other things resulting from climate change, population movement. And the one thing that my research would lead me to conclude is that when these instances happen, largely the news agenda in Britain and America will be unaffected by it.
Yeah, it's a sad indictment. Maybe we'll get a less well. This whole show is an attempt to move away from tabloid coverage into a more profound way, hopefully, of looking at these issues and giving them the attention that reasonable people might argue they deserve. Let's move on, if we may, to your forthcoming book, which is called Front Page Scotland, Newspapers and the Scottish Independence Referendum. Now, that's coming out in the next few months, I gather. Tell us a little bit about it, and why should people rush out and buy a copy when it's available?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to be encouraging people to rush out to the shops and not be observing social distancing and whatnot. But at the same time, I'm fully aware it's not probably going to be flying off the shelves to that degree. No, really, as I would hope that the kind of people that are interested in this would be generally actually the kind of people who I would assume are your listeners and your audience or your viewers. Sorry, is people that have got an interest in politics, an interest in the media, and they're not necessarily closed off to new ideas or being aware that they can learn more about these media dynamics and how they can shape how we think and how political discourse is built up. And primarily is going to be for a Scottish audience. Really, I think maybe other sort of people with a general interest in the media or newspapers might have it, but really it's people that have got a sort of some stake invested in Scotland. And if you've got some basic knowledge of Scottish politics, I think you could read it and take something away from it. Because specifically when I wrote this, as opposed to my first book that we were discussing, is I wrote this specifically more with my friends and family in mind, about how would they read this and find it boring, or would they engage with it and get with the kind of things I'm talking about. And so I've deliberately, but without in any way I think dumbing it down, it's a more accessible text than my last one was, and I would hope that somebody can sit and read it and not just find out more about what happened in 2014, because that in itself would be of quite limited utility, but through the examples and the processes that I'm describing, when they then go out and read a newspaper the next day, they might notice some of these things just with a bit more clarity, or start to notice these little aspects that contribute to a collective understanding of the political landscape.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to, it'd be very tempting, but I don't want to dump on journalists who, by and large, I think do a reasonable job. I'm more than happy to dump on their editors who determine the sort of coverage and the depth of coverage. So that's less a quality issue and more an issue of discrimination, which I think is certainly a lot of people watching or listening to this will be keyed into, I suspect. But you deal with oil economics, the currency, NHS, defence, membership of international organisations, the Queen and the Conservative Party, Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, Labour Party, and Alex Salmond. I mean, that's a broad sweep, and I take it you're looking at the way these entities and individuals were covered by the media, or not, as the case may be.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
What were your conclusions?
Well, because the broad, you did a fine job of like listing all of them. I don't actually think I could have done that off the top of my head. So it's handy that you've touched on all these already, John. The first, I would say, probably like 35-40% of the book is on the way policy was presented. So, economics, defence and whatnot. But then the rest of the book, and I think, to be honest, I think this side is the bit that's a bit more readable and engaging. Is probably what people find more interesting in general, because economics and that kind of dry stuff can be a bit alienating at times. The focus on individuals and how people's remarks were framed and dissected and interpreted is one of the key aspects of the press engagement with the referendum in 2014. Probably one of the most interesting ones. Before I go on to what I assume most people actually already assume is the key one, but one of the most interesting dynamics that sort of I didn't go looking for this. I more went into this research letting the sources speak to me, and then just the patterns that I noticed. Like, don't go in looking for something specific, just to see what comes out. Is an interesting one and quite a revealing one to how certain dynamics in the press actually work. Is what I would describe as the sort of temporary reverence that was given to Gordon Brown, particularly in a very short period just leading up to the final weeks of the referendum, because as much as by all means, Alistair Darling was a sort of safe pair of hands, he didn't really have that same sort of like charisma or political standing that Gordon Brown has. And the interesting aspect of this is that newspapers like the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Telegraph, and the Times, newspapers which historically have given Labour prime ministers and the Labour Party in general quite a hard time. And that's not going to come as a surprise to anybody. Temporarily, they all, for lack of a better word, sort of fell into line, and they started heralding his political legacy and his speech making ability and blah 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 blah, and it's very much one of those the enemy of my enemy is my friend dynamics, and that was one that jumped out at me. And that to me was particularly fascinating, because it shows that even like very very entrenched positions in the press can be temporarily adapted if it's in service of a wider political agenda. So in this instance, centre-right newspapers, which were obviously always pro-conservative, were quite happy to sing the supposed praises of a man who, from 2008 and before, right up until that point, or very, very recently to that point, had largely been demonised, vilified, deconstructed, critiqued in all these newspapers at every opportunity. But suddenly, because he was a big voice, a big Scottish voice, and a big Scottish Labour voice, and what was increasingly being seen to be a referendum that could be very, very close or uncomfortably close, is all these newspapers, because it fitted obviously their evident editorial line, were quite happy to praise Gordon Brown to a degree which would have been unthinkable even a few months before, and to the point where they sort of built him up into this temporary titan. And obviously, as soon as the result was out of the way, you see a complete change in the coverage, because now the focus is on the 2015 general election. So now it's that, you can't really trust the Labour Party and whatnot, and that these same editorial agendas go back into essentially what you would call the status quo. But the main one on that side, in terms of like looking at and this won't come as a particular surprise to a lot of the audience, but the main one that needed an entire chapter dedicated to itself just because there's so much material to go through, was the fact that how much of the coverage was focused specifically on Alex Salmond as an individual. And obviously, you know, and one aspect that was it sort of surprised me because I didn't expect this, is there's more positive coverage of Alex Salmond than you would necessarily first assume. At the same time, it's massively outweighed by negative coverage of Alex Salmond. But the persistent trend that goes across almost every newspaper, but particularly those ones which are actively and explicitly pro-unionist, is you would see that at various opportunities, Alex Salmond essentially becomes synonymous with the more abstract concept of independence. So it gets presented, it gets repeatedly presented that the choice isn't between, you know, staying part of the United Kingdom and Scotland becoming its own country. Your choice is between staying part of the United Kingdom or choosing Alex Salmond's independence, which is a different concept.
Yeah.
To the more abstract notion of independence, which I think that detached notion of independence could have potentially been an easier sell than it being filtered constantly through the sort of, you know, prism of Alex Salmond. But it could be argued that was a deliberate tactic by the press, because they might have known that Salmond himself was a more divisive figure than independence as a standalone concept. And so that one, obviously, that won't come as a particular surprise to people. But in terms of this focus on individuals, it was directed at Alex Salmond to a degree which is no other individual even comes close.
Maybe part of that was this tabloidization that we were talking about earlier, but newspapers have given up, not all of them, but many of them, any attempt to explain and elucidate in preference to just saying, hey, it's about this idiot here rather than that idiot there. You know, it's so much easier. It's so much easier because you can speculate. Whereas if it's a policy, you're then forced to go and look at the research and establish whether it works or whether it doesn't. What about the BBC? If you can be brief, where did they fall on the spectrum of being pro or anti?
To be honest, I wouldn't say as much as I can sort of defer and refer people to, if they were interested in that, to the work of Professor John Robertson. I'm no expert on the BBC, and really in terms of the context of my research is I focus specifically on newspapers. So I'm fully aware that a lot of people, you know, see that the BBC's coverage might have been lacking in a lot of ways and might have pushed a certain agenda in certain instances. But I would really be in no position to actually discuss that, John, because I'm strictly old school and stick with the newspapers.
Fair enough, perfectly reasonable point. But you do talk about the marginal role of female journalists in producing content.
Again, this was one of these things that I didn't really go looking for. Like I didn't. It was only after like a first sort of reading and when I was initially cataloguing these sources that it just at some point and it jumped out to me that when I was cataloguing journalist names, it was it was more like way disproportionately male names that I was typing out. And then when I actually quantified this properly, and this was in I released this in an article with Scottish Affairs. It's called Who Writes the News, if anyone's interested. Because I don't want to sit here and bore people with the specific statistics by any means, and nor could I actually pull most of them out the back of my head anyway. But the long and short of it is that across every newspaper, female journalists made up only a tiny minority of the coverage, usually probably somewhere between, you know, maybe like 15 and 30% of all output. And when you consider that the referendum was supposed to be a national conversation that affected the whole country, and, you know, women make up, you know, roughly 50% of the population, then the fact that female voices were so marginalised is something that I think probably needs to be addressed in the short and long term, because that has to have an impact on the style of the dialogue, the issues that are being discussed. And there is every chance that, because I know in that time there has been a few female journalists, particularly in the sort of independence-based media, have been given like better platforms and have built a well-deserved better reputation. for themselves. But then, should there be another referendum, or should the independence issue become a live question again in the next few years, it could have a more female tone, purely because of the leadership personalities involved. And I would hope that that's maybe reflected in the press, because it might actually generate a different form of coverage, and it might not be the exact same issues that were discussed in the last one, which was based on the coverage and based on the personalities that dictated a very, very male-centric debate with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, and you've also written about the media profile of Ruth Davidson and the Scottish Tories in the last decade. What sort of conclusions do you reach there?
With Ruth Davidson's quite an interesting character in this regard, in terms, and I actually use the term character deliberately, because the way that the media have built her up, particularly post 2014, is through essentially focusing on, through essentially focusing on one single issue of opposing a second referendum under any circumstances, is she managed to temporarily see a brief resurgence in the electoral fortunes of the Scottish Tories. But part of the reason that she's got, I would say, only in Scotland, in terms of female politicians, only Nicola Sturgeon has a greater media profile, I would say, than Ruth Davidson. And a big part of that, to my mind, is particularly the Tory supporting press have been quite happy to give her positive coverage, and like to provide her with soundbite opportunities, or to provide her with photo ops and whatnot, and with very, very little interrogation of her party's wider policies. But because post 2014, obviously the defining issue really remains in Scottish politics is the independence question, is because she positioned herself, and was quite comfortably positioned by the press, as essentially the unionist champion. She's got a political relevance and a political profile, which I don't really necessarily think stands up to a record or anything she's achieved. But she was the right person at the right time, with the right single message. But an interesting thing, just to finally, one last thing about Ruth Davidson, is part of this same dynamic where she's been built up into a unionist champion by the centre-right press, is the fact that retroactively, in 2015, 2016, 2017, there was a lot of references in various media to the role that Ruth Davidson, the crucial role that Ruth Davidson played in the 2014 debate. But if you're at least judging by the newspapers, she's almost a completely peripheral figure. But it's been adapted, it's been adapted in this sort of like Orwellian sense, to say that she was a key voice in 2014 and a key reason for the vote, and the way it turned out it did. But at least judging by the newspapers I've looked at, there's very little evidence to sort of back that up, or give her the credit for that in any way.
It's very, very interesting. Now, your book is published by Routledge, is that right?
Routledge, but I think specifically it's the Taylor and Francis.
Taylor and Francis, yeah. So if somebody was looking for a copy, I mean, obviously they can get it from the publisher. No doubt it will be in the bookshops, which I assume are now fully open again, or close to it. And presumably it'll also be on Amazon and elsewhere.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, because they haven't actually given me a specific publication date, but the fact that like everything on my end is completely done, all the final edits, index, and I'm really just waiting on them finding out and letting me know. But to the best of my knowledge, it probably should be in the next couple of months, and I would certainly hope people can find it in bookshops. But I think Amazon for most people is probably going to be the easiest way of getting it. And certainly I'd be very happy if anybody's actually got an interest in it, because very much a kind of labour of love that's taken me the better part of like 7 years. So I would hope a few eyes can be diverted to it.
Well, I'm sure there will be. Do us a favour, if you wouldn't mind. Let us know, drop me an email or a text or some such thing, and let me know when publication date is approaching. And what we'll do is we'll remind people on the show that it's coming up. And
that's very nice of you, John. I appreciate that. No, I'll certainly do it.
Well, you've been kind enough to be our guest. It's the very least that we can do, frankly, David. So we're more than happy to do it because there's lots of information in books. that are not balanced, and therefore, it's important to make sure that people are aware of those that are. We're sort of running out of time a little bit. We've got 6 minutes to go. I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit briefly, if you wouldn't mind, about American boxing, because you've got yet another book coming out. I think the life and works of Ted Carroll. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Thanks, John. This is one of these, again. It's not a project that I actually expected to happen if you even went back 2-3 years ago, but through multiple conversations with and pestering my boss, my head of department, who's got a sort of encyclopedic knowledge of boxing, to actually work on something, we decided to collaborate. And through his suggestion, and through having read, probably every edition of the Ring magazine going back to its original publication in 1922, is he wanted us to look at this gentleman called Ted Carroll, and it was just a hunch of his to start with, but then as we looked into it, is Ted Carroll worked at the Ring from 1936 to his death in 1973, and by all accounts, from what we can work out, in that period, he was the only black journalist working at that magazine in that entire time. And when you consider, especially if you go back to the start of his career in the 1930s, professional boxing through the likes of Joe Louis and people like that was one of the few aspects of American life where black men could actually compete on the same level and achieve certain things, because they were locked out of things like entertainment, most other professional sports and whatnot. But the reason that we really want to try and bring this guy's journalistic voice to life is despite the fact that he was working at that magazine and writing, what would be a part boxing reviews, part sociological essays on various aspects of American culture and as boxing applied to race and society and whatnot. It's really, really deep themes. He's almost been essentially erased from history. That you can barely find any reference to him in a history book. Even the autobiography of Nat Fleischer, who was the founder and editor of the Ring magazine for decades, he's not mentioned in it. So we're hoping that bringing this edited collection together and with our own work that we've looked into his life, we're really hoping that we can bring his voice to a wider generation or a wider audience, because really his insight is something that I think he's got a voice that deserves to be heard again. It's nice to have been able to be like a small part of bringing that forward.
Good, that's excellent. Well, we'll look out for that, David, in due course. Again, let us know when its publication date is coming up.
Right, thanks, John.
Okay, well, we're almost at an end. We've just got a couple of minutes to go, and I wanted to obviously say a big thank you to David for being with us tonight. I hope, like me, you've learned a lot more, not only about South Africa, but also about the coverage of genocide in 44, 45, and in Bosnia and Rwanda, a little bit about Afghanistan, and latterly talking about the coverage of the 2014 referendum. Do look out, please, for David's book, Dr. David Patrick by Routledge. It'll be available sometime soon. He's going to let us know when that happens, and we'll let you know in turn. A big thank you also to all of you out there watching and joining us tonight. We hope you've enjoyed this TNT show. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. This is the place for the folks who bring erudition as well as enjoyment, we hope. And remember, you can find out all about forthcoming guests on the whatsonguide.scot. We're back next week at the same time with another special guest. Yes activist Mike Fenwick is joining us next Wednesday, and he'll be talking about his petition and the connection that may the possibility perhaps of changing the Act of Union and a whole raft of other things. As always, a reminder to look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National, which is out at the weekend, obviously, and I'll be describing the death of England. It may sound a bit radical, but there are a number of thinkers who believe that the whole concept of a an English state might be in real jeopardy. You'll find the Constitution column, by the way, in the 7-day supplement near the end. And if you like it, tell the editor, Callum Bear. Very importantly, please support India Live Radio. These are the stations for all the news that you're not getting. And thanks again and for joining us. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. To add a touch of merriment to the publication of the JERS figures, which are just out, the joke perhaps is not that these are comical, but rather why the Scottish government still publishes them. I don't know, maybe some of you do. To all of you, please stay safe and take care. And I look forward to seeing you all well and safe next Wednesday at 7 o'clock when the station talks to Mike Fenwick. Thank you again and good night.